Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to a new panel of the 2021 Atlantic Dialogues. My name is Ottaviano Canuto, a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and a former vice president and executive director at the World Bank, former vice president at the Inter-American Development Bank, and a former executive director at the IMF. It is my great pleasure to chair this panel on economic recovery and the Great Reset. The COVID-19 pandemic has plunged the world into a health, social, and economic crisis of exceptional magnitude. In economic terms, the restrictions established to contain the spread of the virus have resulted in a sudden stop to entire sectors of activity and major disruptions to supply chains. There is still ongoing. Consequently, the global economy experienced its worst recession since World War II in 2020, with a 3.3% contraction in real GDP, a sharp decline in trade and direct investment flows, in addition to massive job losses. As a result, the downward trend in poverty that began in the 90s has been reversed, and more than 100 million additional people have fallen back into extreme poverty. Recovery has been uneven, unequal, and incomplete within and among countries. Some economic scarring from the pandemic may be long-lasting, may be expected. Additionally, we wondered about to what extent the pandemic will change the world. And that's what the Great Reset component of our session title refers to. Or accelerate history by reinforcing some previous trends, as I have myself highlighted in a couple of places. And I'm very pleased to have a distinguished, superb group of speakers today to address some of these questions. They have crossed brilliant career paths, as you can read, their bios are circulated. We have Dr. Franny Leautier, who's currently a senior partner at Southbridge Group and CEO of Southbridge Investments. Dr. Leautier's illustrious career includes the World Bank Group, where we crossed our paths for the first time. She held senior financial positions across the World Bank Group, including as vice president. She has held as well leadership roles at the Trade and Development Bank, TDB Group, and she was Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at the African Development Bank, chairing the African Development Bank board for much of the time she was there. We also have Dr. Harinder Kohli, President and CEO of Centennial Group. He's also the founding director and chief executive of Emerging Markets Forum, both based in Washington, D.C. He's the founding editor of Global Journal of Emerging Markets Economies. And prior to his current ventures, he served 28 years in various senior managerial positions at the World Bank. Earlier, he worked in the private sector in England and France. And we might have as well, if we solve the issues, the presence as well of Maria Eugenia Bistuela de Avila, Mayu, who from 1999 to 2004 was Minister of Foreign Affairs of her country, El Salvador. She worked as a director of corporate sustainability at HSBC for Latin America. She's now involved as independent director on banks and insurance companies boards in El Salvador and Honduras, the stock exchanges of El Salvador, as well as board member in nonprofits locally and globally as Vital Voices and Journal Achievement. As you see, by coincidence, or maybe not by coincidence, the three of us now present the panel have in common this background, this common background of some time at the World Bank. So my idea is to ask our panelists one question at a time, ask them to speak briefly for between 5 and 10 minutes each, so that we can later on enjoy the most that we can from the interactions between these great speakers and myself. So to start with, let me ask Franny Leautier, and followed by Dr. Harinder. What are, in your view, the levers to act on for a quick and strong recovery for the world economy? An inclusive one, if possible. So, Dr. Franny.
Thank you very much, Dr. Canuto. It's a pleasure to see you and to see my good friend Harinder as well. I would speak on 5 key levers that I see, and my comments are mostly coming in terms of what I have seen on the ground, particularly in Africa, but in emerging countries in general, which would support the global recovery. The first lever is on the health and nutrition side. I think countries have to continue to focus on eliminating or at least controlling COVID-19 and its health effects, and that requires procurement of vaccines and administrating them, but also procurement of treatments and supplies and equipment for the health sector overall. Because one of the things we noticed is that some of the diseases that are important to treat are not getting attention because HIV and AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, mental health, etc., which are equally important, or things like contraception and family planning are not getting the attention they need because COVID has taken so much over the capacity in the health sector. So it's really key to focus on that and the food supply chains, because nutrition and health are interrelated. And within the health block, also water and sanitation, because those remain key. On economic management, which is a second major lever, I think continuing the work on income and liquidity solutions is really key, particularly in countries that are dependent on the informal sector and SMEs, where innovation in thinking about dealing with liquidity constraints becomes very, very important. And of course, targeted support for sectors that have been very badly hurt by the pandemic, tourism being one of them, trade being the other, and especially the global supply chains within that. And then, of course, investment, because a number of countries have seen capital flight and reduction in foreign direct investment. And within the economic side as well, on the spending, the public finances, particularly around infrastructure, with a focus on electricity and transport and logistics being key. The third lever is on debt, because countries were already highly indebted, and then came COVID, and they have incurred even more serious debt problems. So solving the debt through restructuring is critical. Looking at credit markets, both local and regional, and then of course the liquidity constraints. We've talked about the global level, but also looking more critically at regional and country level constraints. Fourth lever, risk mitigation. I think particularly around insurance, guarantees, and risk readiness in general, because we don't know what other shock may come down the pike. We already are dealing with a number of shocks, so to be ready with a set of instruments. For the last category as a lever, the private sector, here mostly looking at supporting SMEs, bringing solutions for working capital, for growth capital, and helping them as they make the transition to climate action, because that is happening at the same time, and helping them particularly to continue to create jobs and protect the jobs that they are already creating. Thank you.
Thank you, Franny. Very well put. Dr. Harinder, what's your take on the question, please? You're on mute, sir.
Yes. Dr. Canuto, thank you very much for your introduction, and it's great to see you, Franny, again, and your excellent comments. So after both of your comments, I'm like if you would, how would I say? I have to complete the story, and you said much of what needs to be said. So let me add a few thoughts to complete the story. First, I think you said very well, Ottavio, that we're coming out of one of the first recessions, sudden, unexpected recessions since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And you've given the numbers very well. To complete that story, the advanced countries, the so-called advanced countries, the rich countries, by end of this year or by middle of next year, would have recovered back to the pre-COVID GDP levels. But unfortunately, the developing countries would still have a long way to go. Except for China, the rest of the emerging markets will take somewhere between 2 to 4 years to reach the pre-COVID level of economic activity, if they're lucky. So we are seeing a two-step recovery process, and it's not going to be easy. So within that, your question is very well taken. What it will take for emerging economies to take, what are the levers? And I think Franny has given us a very good roadmap. And within that roadmap, let me emphasize, in my view, what is the lessons of what has happened in the world in the last 18 months? What have we learned? The basic lessons we have learned from what has happened in developed economies, but also what has happened in China. The basic lessons is that you have to manage the pandemic. Without managing the pandemic, the economic activities cannot be resumed. So the rest of the emerging markets, they have to put their full attention to managing the pandemic themselves, but with the full support of the international community. Now, this is the main focus where the countries have to focus on. It's not easy. It's a simple task. It's a very complex task. It requires not only vaccination and emphasis on people putting the masks. It's a question of logistics. It's a question of getting access to vaccines. It requires money. It requires logistics. It requires discipline. It requires international cooperation, which has not been forthcoming as required in the past 18 months. Fortunately, the summit, which President Biden called for about 3 months ago, has started the process. A lot of promises have been made by the international community, but in my view, the promises have not yet yielded the results which are required. Fortunately, in the last 3 months, a lot of developing countries have started to catch up. China, by now, has had almost 2 billion shots. India last month crossed 1 billion shots. Brazil just announced that they have vaccination rates which now exceeds the US. That's a positive story. But Sub-Saharan Africa is still around 3 to 4%. Franny was very polite, but there's a long way to go. We need actions on the home front, but we need international community to step up. So this is step number 1. We need total, absolute focus on that. It's easy to say, but it's going to be very difficult to perform. And I think people are saying correctly, until everybody is vaccinated, nobody is safe. And this is urgent, not only for people concerned in individual countries, it's urgent for the rest of the world, because otherwise we'll have many more Delta variants and nobody will be safe. So that's point number 1. This is the task for the world for the next year or so. I'm not sure we're going to enter the post-pandemic world in a hurry, but we'll have to learn to live with the pandemic like we've learned to live with the flu. until people's lives are safe and economic activity at a reasonable level is resumed. Once that is done, and I hope it is done, there is no guarantee it will be done, but let's hope it is done. Then in my view, there are three major issues, and that's point number 2 that I want to make. There are three major issues in front of the whole global community which need attention in medium to long term. What are they? One, Franny already alluded to, and you yourself alluded to, that is inequality. Inequality within the countries, which has been rising. It's a big social and economic as well as political issue. Inequality started rising in the US in 1980s. It started rising in Europe too, but it's a big issue in individual developing countries, China, India. The most unequal region in the world is Latin America, and the second most unequal region in the world is Africa. It is today a global issue. There is a lot of evidence that if inequality continues to rise, it is beginning to affect even economic growth. That issue must be tackled not only at individual country level, but also regional and global level. The second big issue is debt. We are seeing now debt levels which are at record high level, historic high levels. How would the countries grow and tackle debt at the same level? There's a need for discipline at the country level, but international support is also necessary. Without handling of debt, I cannot see how countries will resume growth again. And third big issue, after 2 weeks of Glasgow discussions, is clearly climate change. It is facing us, all of us. And here again, it's not a question of 2050 or year 2100. It is facing us today. Floods, fires, droughts, country after country, city after city. We cannot leave it for our grandchildren. It has to be tackled today along with inequality and debt and other issues. And that brings me to the fourth point. All of the issues that we are talking about, that I mentioned, that Franny mentioned, they require global solutions. And unfortunately, these global solutions are required when multilateralism is under threat, which is it's at the weakest point right now. What happened with the vaccines in the last year or so is a perfect illustration that the global community talks quite a lot about solidarity, but is unable to deliver on solidarity. People are falling back on nationalism. We need to strengthen multilateralism. Everybody, whether it's climate change, whether it's debt, whether it's vaccines. And I think forums like ours should be raising our voice, saying we need to strengthen multilateralism, whether it's WHO, whether it's WTO, or it's IMF, or the World Bank, or other international institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hinder. And welcome, Minister Maria Eugenia. I already introduced you, and in any case, the audience has the bios of the three of you information. And the question that I had asked Franny and Harinder was, what would you see as the levers to act for ensuring a quicker and stronger recovery for the world economy, a more inclusive one. So please, Minister Maria Eugenia.
Good day to all. I first want to thank the Policy Center for the New South for their kind invitation to again be present in such an important event as the Atlantic Dialogues. I'm honored to accompany such distinguished panelists and would like to address our moderator, Ottaviano's question from the point of view of our developing region in Central America, as its similarities to other developing countries can be fruitful to this discussion, even if I repeat much of what Franny and my dear friend Harinder have already said. Allow me to quote Jason Marsat from the Atlantic Dialogue, where I am a non-resident senior fellow, as he describes in his paper on COVID-19 recovery in Latin America, that the way the Americas was hit was harder by the COVID pandemic than any other region in the world, accounting for nearly a third of all global deaths attributed to the disease. The responses to the pandemic, including ongoing school closures, shutdowns of millions of businesses, have resulted in the largest recession since the Great Depression. And Latin America and the Caribbean economies were hit hardest in 2020, with regional GDP contraction of negative 7.7%. That is over 3 percentage points higher than the world average. Regional growth predictions for 2021 are estimated to still be insufficient to recover pre-COVID activity levels. So we will still be lagging behind the rest of the world for a couple of years. But amid ongoing social and economic disruption, the inequality in Latin America, we are the world's most unequal region, it is rising, exactly as Rita has already stated. Millions are falling into poverty. Corruption has been rampant. Disinformation massively circulated. And in the face of the pandemic's multidimensional effects, greater international cooperation is fundamental to combat global crisis. Multilateralism is vital. Thus, I believe it is in the interest of the developed world to partner with my region and the developing world in its COVID-19 recovery. A Latin America and the Caribbean that is secure, economically prosperous, and democratic provides stability and opportunities for all. This is all the more essential in today's chaotic and unpredictable world. So to your question, to help Central American countries and the rest of the developing world, it is of the essence to first secure a vaccine. In our region, both the United States directly and through COVAX, as well as China and Russia, have either donated or sold vaccines to the region. In addition to trying to secure equitable vaccine access and distribution, Central America faces a multitude of issues worsened by the pandemic. The struggling healthcare systems, the lagging supply chains, rising social tensions, increasing corruption, the changing climate, and challenging macroeconomic conditions. COVID hit everything, and most for us, tourism. We can work together to address these issues through a strategy that relies on partnerships and helps to achieve inclusivity and resilience. We can prioritize greater regional cooperation, stronger partnerships with developed countries, and a return to the principles of multilateralism. We must foster prosperity in the region together with the pandemic recovery. So what can we do specifically? Allow me then to answer your levers within this framework and Jason's 7-point plan to help the region rebuild stronger. First one is investing in health. This is a key regional of importance because the international agencies should direct increased investments, not only, as I stated, to handing the vaccine, but also to countries to invest in their health sectors. They need help in areas such as research and development, disease surveillance, the distribution. So the country's contribution to COVAX is essential. Second is the future of global supply chains. You would say, what does that have to do? It's an immediate recovery. As the global supply chain is placing itself throughout the world, it has to include Latin America. And we are in a position to be there. And as we update to a 21st century version of free trade agreements or other trade engagements, multi-country regional projects have to be structured so that they are attractive to private sector investment. And Africa, Latin America, we all are able to build on our infrastructure and technology to attract these investments. So harnessing the financing of regional banks and also of the World Bank to be able to leverage private and public investment in infrastructure that reduces transport costs. Third is building resilient economies. This means addressing, first of all, corruption and also rethinking debt policy. So heed and amplify the calls from the World Bank for debt restructuring for Latin American countries amid the increased fiscal pressures resulting from the COVID pandemic. We also have to foster the establishment of private-public partnership frameworks and expand our current anti-corruption efforts by directing new funding toward initiatives to strengthen the judicial systems and improve our system of regulation. Fourth, climate action, which means implementing commitments and integrating policies. You saw it in the newspapers several months ago. Because of our region, which is hit hard by back-to-back hurricanes and drought, we had climate migrants walking from Honduras in caravans all the way to the United States. Fifth, tourism. It is a key driver to boosting economies and sustainability. But we have to promote a multi-stakeholder collaboration between international organizations, the private sector, and academia to accelerate these sustainable tourism solutions. Education, even if they say it's more long-term, it is also urgently needed to promote public-private alliances to accelerate the development of digital platforms that we can enhance teaching and learning processes. And last is democracy and governance. We have to continue working together to strengthen institutions, to thus be able to provide renewed support in anti-corruption trainings, combating financial crimes, strengthening judicial branches, supporting observation of elections through missions organized in my region, for example, by the OAS. And lastly, to foster a broader and more important role for civil society to help advance government accountability, not only through aid and technical capacity building, but also the political work of recognition and credit of civil social organizations. Thus, I am so proud of what your institute fosters events like this, thus to support the strengthening of civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Maria Eugenia. Let me then move on to a second question, which is the following. Which enduring consequence would you highlight from the pandemic? Is there any sense in which one may say that the pandemic will accelerate or change history? Let me start this time with Mr. Harinder. Dr. Harinder, please.
Thank you. I think, we've done some modeling and two things followed of that. We've done long-term modeling of the world economy. In our model, we have 196 countries, and we developed different scenarios going through 2060. And two things come out of that. One, that the world as a whole will lose about 1 year of GDP overall. But most of this loss will be suffered by emerging markets. And the reason is that, as I mentioned earlier, that it's emerging markets who are going to take much slower to recover from pandemic, between 2 to 4 years longer than the developed economies. And the developed economies, as I mentioned, would have recovered to their pre-pandemic GDP level by either end of this year or by middle of next year. So the big loss will be suffered by emerging markets as a whole. And if you take into account that China actually did not suffer as much as the rest of the emerging markets, and China accounts for a big chunk of GDP of emerging markets, then non-China emerging markets' loss is even more. So that's point number one. But within that, the people who suffer the most within the emerging markets are the poor segments of society. So poorer people, the bottom 40% of the world, and within developing countries, the bottom 40% have suffered the most. So that's point number one, which is coming out of our work. And secondly, is the point which I already emphasized, that the developing countries as a whole, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, is coming out of the pandemic with a record level of debt. And their ability to resume growth is really hampered quite a lot. And without international help, that heavy debt burden combined with their inability to vaccinate their people is putting them at tremendous disadvantage coming out of the pandemic. So the short to medium term as well as long-term prospects are very difficult. And if you put on that the third layer, and I'll stop after mentioning the third layer, which makes me very worried, that climate change probably means, and after the agreement in Glasgow, that the prospects for people who produce and rely on export of fossil fuels, whether it's oil or gas or coal, the prospects of these fossil fuels or the medium to long term are not very good. So countries who rely on exports of oil, which is Middle East, but also countries like Nigeria and countries like South Africa, which rely on export of coal, that by the way also includes Australia and US, they will suffer quite a lot. Now, if you combine with the other factors, the countries will need to adjust quite a lot. This includes Brazil, this includes Mexico. So the countries will need to make major adjustments over the medium to long term if they want to prosper. So the fundamental, if you would, structural changes which the countries need to make coming out of the pandemic. So the bottom line I have, unfortunately, that the post-pandemic world, if there is a post-pandemic world, is going to be quite different than the way the world was before 1989.
All right, Hardo, thank you very much. Let me then ask Franny to give her take on what she thinks the most enduring consequence of the pandemic in terms of history.
Thank you very much, Dr. Canuto. I think Dr. Colley gave the global perspective, so I'm going to go one level beneath and share what I think will be the lasting or enduring consequences of the pandemic. I think the first one is the importance, the depth, and the speed of the digital transformation, because during the pandemic, we've had to rely enormously on that, and I think that is going to continue and it will deepen as we go forward. and the role of digital solutions, the digital economy, and everything around it. We saw it in countries where mobile payment systems became the lifeline by which governments could actually make social transfers to households during the very difficult times, but also to make solutions for liquidity available to the domestic banking sector and to the small and medium enterprises as well. The second one, which I think will also be lasting, is fundamental changes in the labor markets. If you look at the way jobs have been protected or created or lost during the pandemic, I think a lot of those will endure beyond the pandemic. Location of work being one of the key areas which was driving many labor market solutions, but now that has been broken wide open. Yet some jobs have become even more dependent on location. So I think the split between what is location dependent and what is not will deepen. And also there may be barriers that get stiffened and there are barriers that get loosened. On the barriers that get stiffened, for example, now if you have to apply for a job online, then things about you that are visible in your digital profile, like your gender, like your race and so on, may make it harder for people to be included into the job market. However, on the other hand, if you are a working parent with a young child and can now work from home, it may become easier. So I think these barriers, again, will completely change and would need to think through that in a different way. Third, industrialization policies. A lot of countries have looked inward because they have had structural difficulties and logistics difficulties in getting what they need. And made at home becomes a very strong industrial policy. In the case of many countries in the developing world, being able to control the pharmaceutical supply chain became very critical. Vaccinations, being able to control the goods that you need that can no longer be delivered because the import markets were disrupted and the supply chain. So a lot of countries are looking at how to reduce dependence or having dependence to nearest neighbors. And that is going, I think, to continue for some years. Trade, I think, will change tremendously post-pandemic and trade policy with the preference for nearest neighbor, regional trade so that you can minimize the dependence on one or two big markets. But then there are two other areas which are more on the softer side with deep implications. The first one is the way we look at risk. I think the whole perception of risk readiness, and how we prepare for these massive shocks is going to change the way in which risk management gets treated within companies, within economies, and at the global level. And the other one, which I think is disturbing and difficult because we need to work on it much harder, is on polarization and trust. I think there has been a huge hit to trust as a result of the pandemic at the family level, at the community level, but also amongst countries. And so it has created even more polarization, even around things like facts and how they're interpreted, how countries support each other, who's considered a friend, etc. I think all these will be long-lasting and they'll have an impact on the world. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Franny. Maria Eugenia, please.
Yes, thank you very much. And I applaud Franny's comments and would then also take a third level dive after her and concentrate on the consequences in family. Family is the most crucial element within our society. And because of COVID, we have seen the hit and the impact and the consequences in family. Let me start first, housing, for example. There is the housing distress for many, the displacement that has occurred, the resilience needed as you are being thrown more into poverty. Middle class families that have been forced to step down because of the lack of work as businesses were closed. The impact on housing. Secondly, is in regards to children. The children and the capacity that they have had to continue their studies, to be able to be also within a growing community where many of them have been completely isolated by these boundaries of COVID protection. And third is women. And that is where I want to make my most important point. I truly believe in the sense that COVID has given us women, and I speak as a woman, has given us an opportunity, but there are consequences, also negative. The first one that was negative for women during COVID was the increase in domestic violence, because many were enclosed, trapped with their oppressors. And so the increase we saw is not only in Latin America, it is throughout the world, the increase in domestic violence. And this is something we, again, have to be able to bring in the support, the emergency lines to be able to detonate the proximity of aid for these women. But there is also a positive side for women within the pandemic, because I sense a change specifically in the flexibility and the validation of work from home. COVID and the times of closure because of the pandemic and the growth of work from home has given women the flexibility that allows them to cater to family responsibilities, both children and elders, as well as continuing their corporate and executive involvements. This is very positive, because if we are able that as we go back to the new normal, that this new normal contemplates the benefits of women's acquired flexibility and makes work flexibility part of the new normal with the regulation and the facilities for it, I truly believe that this change will allow for a dormant workforce to fully enter, contributing to our country's development. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Eugenia. And since you brought in particularly the dimension of housing distress, domestic violence, gender equality, and human development related issues, let me take the chance and ask you then, which place do you see for human development in the post-COVID development strategies?
I think it has to be centered. And as we are, starting our strategic implementations of the different processes that we need within our development, the human being, it's the person that has to be at the center of it. Allow me to give you an example in Central America. In Central America, we, back in the 2000s, we negotiated free trade agreements. And what we had at the core of all of our planification of bringing in an openness of two bigger markets that would allow us as countries to increase our exports, we should have thought even closer at the role and the impact for the human being, for that individual. Because at the end, what we need is the most important way of looking at why do I open up my country and why do I foster free trade agreements is because I want to bring in more and better jobs for the individual, for human development. And thus, it becomes with a positive spiral of education, of health systems, of productiveness that will allow also for the establishment of pension funds, of a security system for the individual. And as we begin with this positive spiral of human development, it can thus be able to deal more with the human dysfunctionalities like domestic violence and others. But I do believe that COVID is giving us the opportunity to rethink the why. The why is it that we want to open the country, or to why is it we want to, become more immersed in open commerce? The why is for the individual, is for human development, is to be able to foster a better livelihood for this and the next generations in a sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Eugenia. And Franny, both of us had a rich experience at the World Bank Group. And I'm pretty sure that we both learned a lot the relevance of the component in terms of human capital in the wealth of nations. And this has been further developed and increasingly even measured. So what place for human development and human capital accumulation do you foresee in post-COVID development strategies?
Thank you very much for the question. I'm again going to start where Minister Maria Eugenia left and talk about why this pandemic has created a difference in the way we think about human development. First and foremost, because it threatened human life. And therefore, the centrality of human life and humanity became very important. And therefore, the polarization, which created a difference between who has access to healthcare, who doesn't, who has access to vaccination and who doesn't, became very deepened. And I think that's going to be something that as a human race, we will be more conscious of as we go forward, because it was really very visible and very obvious. The second aspect, I think, is education, because again, the pandemic hit us on the education front almost immediately, with kids not able to go to school, with teachers being afraid to teach because of the different approaches that we took to dealing with the pandemic. And therefore, the importance of education and how to deliver it differently, which used to be things you would think about, the remote access to education and people who are difficult to reach, but that became then an opportunity for solutions for everyone, using digital platforms, distance learning, and bringing teachers from one environment into another, which would help us solve the quality of education problem going forward, so that good education can be distributed more widely. I think that is really key. But the third one, in my view, when you look now, health and education, was this whole question around livelihoods and the importance of what does it mean to be an essential worker? Because the people who became essential were those who were growing the food, preparing the food, and distributing it and bringing it to where it needs to go. The people who were taking very difficult jobs in the transport sector, which we see now in the supply chain constraints, are very critical. The health workers who were taking major risks, but also people who are providing home care, because the importance of working from home and therefore the burden sharing around taking care of the household while doing your job, and all these equalities around work, I think, became very obvious. And going forward, I think we're going to think about what is essential in a different way, and where are the limits to automation, and where are the limits to work dislocation. And then finally, I think from a human development point of view, because during the early days of the pandemic, many of the large cities, because of lockdown, enjoyed such wonderful, quiet, clean air and much more habitable environments because of the lack of pollution, or at least the reduction of pollution. That expectation of a higher quality of life in larger cities is going to sustain. And you can see it already with people now demanding more solutions in big cities to solve the challenges that the normal pre-pandemic world was delivering. And of course, we notice then the people who are living in slums or in neighborhoods that are depressed didn't have those solutions. And now a lot of attention in thinking about providing parks, thinking about indoor air pollution, being able to take care of water and sanitation needs in crowded spaces. Heat was a key issue. So managing heat in the slum areas through new materials for roofing and so on. So this whole aspect about the human experience, particularly in crowded areas, is, I think, going to be very important. So those are the aspects of human development, I think, are going to continue to evolve and be important in the coming months and years.
Fantastic. You gave us all, the three of you, a very broad and inclusive list of issues that will demand not only attention, but particularly further development of thought. As enduring consequence of the pandemic, we had two different degrees of endurance, of course. First of all, the uneven impact in terms of income distribution, with consequent labor market scarrings. Franny observed the unequal impact, particularly in the case of contact-intensive service during the pandemic. But there is also, as both of them referred to, the digital transformation that might bring additional challenge to many of these workers who will need to be upgraded in their skills. The digital transformation was already in course, but definitely the pandemic has accelerated it. And it seems to have changed the strategies of companies towards exploring further. And it's clear that digitalization made a huge stride forward, and it's one of the consequences of the pandemic. You all as well mentioned debt, the debt legacy. The debt legacy is universal to different degrees, of course, because the advanced economies can cope more easily with the debt legacy associated to the pandemic. But in some cases, as we know, most likely we will have to have some sort of concerted, smooth process of debt restructuring. Don't ask me exactly which countries I would touch, but we know that fortunately we have some thoughts on that framework that is being developed by multilateral institutions, but we'll have to have a stronger multilateral effort to help these countries riddled with debt, with unsustainable debt, to cope with it. You will all as well mentioned the quite important, the change in perception of risks that Franny highlighted, the logic of the global value chains that has prevailed, that is to say, lean value chains looking for minimizing costs may give way to a more risk-weighted framework in which the location of the links or value chains will be different from what they are today. Of course, this has been interpreted by some as a trend towards relative deglobalization, but the issue deserves further discussion. You all as well, the three of you, highlighted, and that's the upside of this whole thing, some dimensions that have come to the fore, and maybe the awareness, particularly by the younger people, about the relevance of those topics. It has been a contribution from the pandemic, namely the need to do something to react to the tendency towards heating, the climate change, as well as on topics like Maria Eugenia highlighted, the need to have attention to gender inequality issues and the like. So we are, very close to the end, and I guess we all had here, given by you, a reasonably broad and interesting array of topics that will need further thoughts, and that's what the Atlantic Dialogues are for. Franny and Maria Eugenia would like to say anything before we close?
Just thank you very much. It was a pleasure to participate, and I look forward to learning more from the Policy Center. And you did a great job moderating us, so thank you very much.
I the same also, Ottaviano. Thank you for your guidance. The public may not see it here, but he has given weeks of preparation and linking us also with the themes that the Policy Center wanted to be able to pose from all this multi-perspectiveness of geographies and ethnicities from which your panelists are contributing. Thank you, Ottaviano.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you all for being with us here and to the next Atlantic Dialogues discussion. Thank you.